of port staff, stevedores, marshallers, as well as a couple of admin people working in the office. Most of the sample was male, which is pretty representative of the people working on the port. It was pretty much 50-50 distribution over the Mount and Tauranga side of the port. 57% were accredited persons, 31% were not, and 8% were not sure if they were accredited or not. So that was a key, something that came out of it. We've got to ensure that people know whether they're accredited people or not. Okay, so what were some of the results? I'm not sure how easy that is to see. So we asked port staff to rate how confident that they were that they understood what biosecurity was, and they were pretty confident. On average, it was 5.6 out of 7. We also asked them to provide a written definition of what they understood biosecurity to be, and then we rated those definitions on a scale of 1 to 5. We found that there was a portion, the graph's not up here, but there was a portion who provided a contaminated definition, so there was something in their definition which wasn't correct, so it might have included chemical spills or drugs or general biological hazards, so that was something to address, improving that definition of their understanding of biosecurity. We asked them that if an incursion occurred, how do you think you would be affected and how do you think the port would be affected? They said that their jobs would be lost, the work might slow down, and a worst case scenario, the port might shut down. But on the good side, only 7% thought that there would be no impact at all of an incursion. So then we looked at some of the key resources that we're providing to port staff to improve their awareness. So we've got the biosecurity calendar, which is down the back there, and then also some bi-monthly alerts that get sent out about what are the current pest threats. So we found that about half of all staff had seen those 2 key resources, and they rated them as moderately useful. And then we also asked, so how do you see MPI? Do you see them as a partner on the port? Do you see them as purely a regulator? And we found that 54% see them as a partner and only 2% see them as a regulator, which is nice. So they appreciate that relationship. And then they rate on average at 8.6 out of 10 that it is highly likely that they will report a biosecurity incursion if it occurs. There was a little group there who said it was neither likely or unlikely, and that indicated that it depended on some other conditions as to whether they were going to report or not, and that appeared to be how busy they were, how busy the port was, the pressure on them, and if they knew someone at MPI or their line manager who they could call and reliably know that that person would pick up the phone and respond to their incursion or potential incursion. Okay, so the transitional facility staff, we sent out an online survey. We got 37 responses to that, and then we also conducted 6 in-depth interviews to understand what are the barriers and enablers for this group of reporting. Most of the sample was again male, 84%, most were European, 70% were accredited persons, and 30% weren't. There weren't any people who were unsure whether or not they were APs, which is great. Okay, so on average, staff somewhat agree that they received up-to-date information about biosecurity threats at 6.9 out of 10. 70% of the staff had seen the monthly alerts, and 66% had seen the biosecurity calendar, so quite a lot higher than the port staff had seen those resources, and they rated them as more useful. In terms of their relationship with MPI, 65% of staff thought that MPI was around to check that the rules were being followed, and 22% saw MPI as purely a regulator, but most staff ticked multiple boxes, so they saw them as playing multiple roles. 97% of staff had received training to become a transitional facility officer, and a third of them had undertaken other industry-specific biosecurity training, which might have been before they arrived at that transitional facility. Half of staff wanted more training, and that was a bit lower than the port staff, so 73% of port staff reported that they wanted more training in biosecurity. And 95% said that they would be highly likely to report a biosecurity concern, so again considerably higher than the port staff. From the interviews, the TF staff saw that they really did play a critical role in the biosecurity system. They saw themselves as the first line of defence, and they took their role very seriously, but they did express concern that with the increase in volumes coming through the port, that there'd be increased risk and the ability of MPI to keep up with that role to come and help them to implement the biosecurity processes. Okay, so the local community. So we looked at the 15,000 people in the immediate Mount vicinity. It was delivered via a survey, so geo-targeted social media, so they got a request on their, through their Facebook or Instagram to say, would you like to complete this survey? Got 324 responses. The average age was 48, which is a little bit older than the national average, and we had slightly more females respond than males, so 55% female. But in terms of ethnicity, it was roughly representative, so 83% European and 14% Māori. So in terms of the understanding, we provided a list of categories about biosecurity and said, which of these do you think is included in biosecurity? And they tended to tick. The top one was risky pests, weeds and diseases, so that's great, as well as inspecting cargo and setting import requirements. 82% had seen, read or heard something about pests, weeds or diseases in the past year. So that was fantastic, a really high percentage. But then we said, have you actively searched for information about biosecurity? And we found that only 32% said yes. So still fairly high, but we find that for the most part, those people are passively receiving that information rather than actively going out and getting it. And 5% have attended biosecurity events run by the Port of Tauranga, so for example Biosecurity Week like this, which kind of makes sense because most of the events have been focused on the port staff rather than the local community at this stage. We asked them, how important do you think it is to protect New Zealand from biosecurity? And they rated it as 9.7 out of 10, so really important. 82% said that they could help reduce biosecurity threats getting into New Zealand, so a really high proportion agreeing that they can make a difference for biosecurity. And then we said, and what would you do if you found a potential biosecurity threat? So about a third said that they would do some research online, find out more about that pest and then decide whether to follow up or not. 23% said that they would contact someone that they trusted, so someone who they thought knew more about pests to decide what the best action moving forwards was. And 54% said that they would contact authorities, so contact their MPI hotline. So we could definitely improve that percentage who are willing to call the hotline immediately. So this is just an interesting graph comparing some of those key statistics across the three groups. So the blue bar is the self-rated understanding of biosecurity. So you can see that it's fairly high across all of the groups, but very high among the transitional facility staff. The extent to which they see biosecurity as a threat to the Port of Tauranga, again consistently high across the board. And then their ability to make a difference for biosecurity, interestingly, a little bit higher among the local community than the port staff. Okay, so across those three groups, we found in general that stakeholders tend to be aware about biosecurity and they say that they're really concerned about it as an issue. However, there's some discrepancy between the reported and actual understanding of biosecurity. So with the port staff specifically, when we asked them to provide a rating of how confident they were that they understood biosecurity and then write that written definition of biosecurity, we found that there was no relationship between those two things, which was quite concerning. So it's hard to know how exactly to measure that awareness. Do we ask them to write a definition, or do we think that it's accurate enough for them to provide that rating on a scale of how much they understand, and is that actually reflective of their understanding? So continued education was the key priority that came out for all of the groups, and in general that was about defining what is biosecurity, what is included inside of that definition and what is not, current pest and disease threats, and what individuals can do to help. So we need a consistent, simple process for each of those groups with the reporting. And then a need to translate the concern into proactive biosecurity behaviours. So we see that all of the groups say that they're concerned, but how do we actually turn that into action of them doing something about biosecurity? How do we make that easy for them? So what, this is a picture of us collecting the data last year on the port. So I've gone around and presented this talk to a lot of different stakeholder groups, and we've collectively made sense of it, and with the key stakeholders to say where to from here. And we've shared the findings amongst the wider industry, so I think this was in the Kiwifruit Growers newsletter recently. And then we've used it to improve the existing interventions and design new interventions. So as a result, so there's been some changes made to the biosecurity calendar this year from the findings, and we're looking at putting a biosecurity kit down on the port, so some little bags and bottles for reporting and some simple reporting cards to say, here's how you do it, here's the consistent process. And then next steps for this research, so we're actually doing industry next as another group that we want to look at, and that's what the survey on your chairs was today. So we're looking at kiwifruit growers, avocado, passion fruit and forestry, and we're looking at saying what are you doing at the moment on your orchard for biosecurity, and what are the barriers to you doing more, and how can we help you with that? So if you can fill that in, that would be fantastic. And also if you'd like to have a conversation with me about any of these things, I'm more than willing to talk about it. I think that's all. Yes.
Are you carrying out the security checks in the other ports, or is Tauranga the only port you're doing it in?
Tauranga is a case study at the moment. We haven't expanded to any other ports, but that's certainly something that we'd like to look at. We've discussed looking at Auckland as a comparison, especially because Tauranga is likely to come out looking pretty great comparatively. It's a smaller area, so it's a lot easier to control, I guess, and there's a lot of proactive action in this area. So that's something we'd like to do.
Hi, very interesting talk. Carolyn Bleach, Ministry for Primary Industries. I manage the Surveillance and Incursion Investigation Plant Health team. So interesting to see the engagement with MPI for notifying, a little bit disappointing. I wanted to let people know that it's an area that we're working on. We've recently employed an engagement surveillance person, and we have a general surveillance person, Kelly McKenzie, and I wondered whether you'd, yeah? Yep. Kelly's here, yeah? Yep. So just so that you're aware, it is an area that MPI is working very, very hard on improving. Thanks.
Hi. Have you got any technology to identify the bugs, like your phone apps and things like that? Because I know I talked to Matt about it at some course we went to a while back. But how far away is that being launched so that we can quickly identify what we're looking for?
I don't think I'm the best person to answer that. Yeah.
I can talk to it. Thanks. So we have, as part of the National Science Challenge Biological Heritage work, we went through phase 1 of this Catch a Pest app. Kiwifruit was one of the pilot groups selected. We have currently just agreed to co-fund the next stage of development and enhance on that. It'll probably still be, at least initially, more of an industry app, and maybe available for port workers as well. It's still probably some ways away from something that the general public would pick up. But it is in progress, it's still going, and MPI has been supportive of that process as well.